Apple just spent tons of money making a spatial story for the Vision Pro. They're touting this as the future of storytelling. Is that the case? Let's find out. At a high level, you're in a submarine and the submarine gets hit and it starts to sink. Sick. Perfect idea for a story in VR because it's a closed environment. It's one that most people haven't spent any time in, so it feels new and cool and beautiful. And they do it really well. There's a lot of creative choices that are made here. Starting with, first off, all stories made on the Vision Pro seem to be non-6 degrees of freedom. You can't move your head forward or around. You can't move your body in space. If you do, the perspective doesn't change. It's just 180-degree stereoscopic, which also means that as you look straight ahead, things look stereo, but because the camera they film this on just has two eyes pointing straight ahead, when you, in VR, point your head to the left, for example, at like 90 degrees, you're still being shown something that was recorded with two cameras that were facing forward. So now all of a sudden there's not that much of a difference between what the right camera and the left camera were seeing. And that means that the stereo effect really, really diminishes the further you turn away from the center. Even though it is 180 degrees stereo, you basically have to look straight the whole time. What that means kind of practically is that there's this sweet spot that even though the camera is seeing everything, the viewer is disincentivized on a kind of gut level from looking around too much because it just doesn't feel right. What that means in Submerged is if the director wanted you to look down at something, then he didn't just film straight ahead to make the viewer look down. He actually took the entire camera rig and aimed it down. Now what the effect is in VR is that I'm sitting here in this chair looking straight ahead because that's what I'm looking at, but now all of a sudden my perspective has been shifted down and there's kind of this weird uneasy effect that happens as I'm now looking down, or like the world has had to tilt up to meet me. So that's the effect of camera angles. That's one of the key differences between traditional flat cinema camera angles and spatial camera angles, is that the viewer's body is included in the perspective shifts. For me, that experiment of tilting the camera up and down is a fail. We can't do that again. The second experiment I want to talk about is camera moves. A lot of people get nauseous in virtual reality, and so the cameras are often very locked, but it's hard to tell a story in cinema with the camera on sticks on a tripod the whole time. Submerged has taken some really crazy risks here. They built an entire crane from scratch that can allow them to move the camera through space, and one of the things I noticed was that as long as the camera is moving at a constant speed, or at a constant velocity, then it doesn't affect our inner ear at all. It's kind of the same thing as like when you're sitting on a train and the train starts moving so slowly that the velocity feels constant, and you look out the window and you can't tell if you're moving or someone else is moving. It's because your frame of reference is constant. So as long as the camera moves are constant in a spatial medium, then I think motion sickness is not so much of an issue, and we can still do camera moves. So that experiment, I would say, deem is a success. While we're talking about camera moves, there's also something that happens when the submarine gets hit, which is that your perspective gets shaken all around. And I would say that's a success. The characters themselves are being shaken around and the camera is being shaken around, and you feel the hit because your body is now being shaken around too, and that feels really destabilizing in a successful, good way. The third thing I want to talk about is close-ups. Close-ups are one of the best parts of cinema because they give you this intimate perspective on someone's face. Here's the thing, that does not translate spatially. Because in space, if you're seeing someone's face this close up, that means they're way too close to you, and it is not comfortable. So there's a bunch of times in Submerged where, in order to give us an intimate close-up of someone, now all of a sudden our entire field of view is filled with their head, and you are seeing this guy's pores as if you are this close to him. That experiment failed. Spatial storytelling will need a new form of the close-up that shows intimacy, and it may need to take into account normal human ideas of personal space, which are cultural too. In the United States, where I am, a meter of personal space between you and the person you're talking to is quite normal, and then any closer than that, and it's kind of like the only times in our lives where that close to someone is when we're gonna hug or kiss them. So this overarching idea of the viewer in a spatial story has their own spatiality to them. They have a body, and that body becomes inside the story. We need to start taking into account where we are forcing that person's body to be. And if we're forcing that person's body to be really close to another person, we are forcing the viewer to invade someone else's personal space. The fourth thing I want to talk about is agency. There's one scene where a bug is crawling towards you. It's a close-up, you're on the ground of the submarine and a bug's just crawling along. You have no agency to leave. The only agency you really have is to look around, but you are stuck there with the bug crawling towards you. This is potentially a powerful effect because you can make the viewer feel trapped. We do similar things in thriller and horror genres, but again, in a spatial medium, it is the viewer's body that is trapped in this location. It's not your attention that's trapped in the story. So there is a different effect. I think that Apple made some really good choices to remove agency in these early spatial stories because it increases linearity, it decreases complexity because you don't have this narrative that has to branch in all these different directions based on whether or not the viewer went over here, picked up this object, talked to this person, did this thing, looked in that direction. The story is allowed to be completely linear. So I actually think that removing agency in spatial stories is successful. That's not to say that there's no room for agency in spatial stories in the future, but as far as adding three-dimensional spatiality to a linear narrative, it is successful even when you have no agency. The fifth thing I want to talk about is leading shots. It's kind of an extension to this sense of being trapped or this lack of agency. There's one moment where the protagonist is walking down a hallway. He's walking down the hallway and you're following him, and you're first looking over his shoulder as he's approaching a dark, scary room with no lights on. And then the shot flips and all of a sudden you're seeing him come towards the room, but you are inside the room. And this is a totally normal narrative convention in two-dimensional cinema, but in 3D the effect is completely different because my body, your body, the viewer's body is now in the scary dark room, and it's the protagonist who's actually still out there in safety. And what that means is we feel crazily elevated when we're in here, but then when the shot flips back to be behind his shoulder again, and we're on the outside of the room, that shot now has no power because we've already been in harm's way. We were already forced to be in this dangerous environment. So again, when we think about cuts and shot, reverse shot, and follow shots and lead shots in spatial storytelling, it's really important to consider that with every shot, the viewer's body is being transported into that location, and each location will have an emotional effect on the person's body. And if that effect is, oh my gosh, you just put my body in a scary place, and then you remove my body from the scary place, tension won't continue to ramp up. Tension has already accidentally reached a peak when you first teleported me into the scary place. The sixth thing I'll say is about dialogue. This may not be specific to spatial narratives because bad writing's bad writing across the board, but there is something deeply cringe about dialogue that is not believable when you are sharing space with other people. It doesn't feel like the theater. You're not watching people act on stage where we can use dialogue that's a little more contrived than in everyday life. It's not cinema where dialogue can also be a little more contrived. When you feel like you're actually just sitting in a kitchen listening to two people talk as friends, it becomes immediately obvious when the things they're saying are not things that two friends would say to each other. When their conversation includes backstory that they obviously would already know about each other, like, yeah man, it's funny, I grew up on the ocean, now I hate the ocean. You're like, you guys have served on this submarine for weeks at least, months maybe, years potentially. Obviously you know this backstory about each other, and it feels awkward and performative for us to observe it. And there's something about the spatial quality of sitting at a table with people where it becomes just totally obvious that this dialogue is contrived. From a dialogue and character development perspective, Submerged fails because spatial stories might require a higher bar for believability because it's so much harder to suspend disbelief. One final note on the camera not just being a way to see action, but the location of the viewer's body, is that in many scenes, the viewer is locked out of a room as a door is closed. And there is a subtle effect that's worth paying attention to, which is that we, the viewer, then feel excluded from the action that's about to happen. And when a cut takes place that then flips us into the new room where the action has continued, there's this sense that the space is less believable, it's less congruent, because we're teleported through the walls after being locked out. This is a subtle one that people might disagree with, but my hunch is that as we start to see more spatial stories across the board, we'll stop seeing the camera as just eyes that are watching action, and we'll realize that the camera is the viewer's body and that we need to include them in the action and include them as the story progresses, or else they're going to start to disengage and the whole story universe will feel less immersive and realistic to them. So ultimately, I found Submerged a really wonderful first foray into scripted spatial storytelling. I will say that after watching Submerged, I wanted to see what else is on offer at Apple, and so I just started to watch a flat pilot episode, a 2D pilot episode for a TV show, and I found the first 15 minutes of that more engaging and believable and frankly immersive than any of Submerged. And that's maybe the final point I want to leave us on, which is that this is a new medium. We don't have rules yet. That's what's exciting about it. That's what we love about it. It's almost unfair to compare spatial stories to an art form where for a century and a half, people have been iterating and coming up with new ideas of where, someone had to invent the close-up. Someone had to invent a way to move the camera. Someone had to invent the cut. One of the most fun things to me about Submerged is that it's shown that, at least in this context, a traditional cinematic cut can work. But all of the nuances about how you're cutting and where you're pointing the camera and how we are bringing the viewer's body with us into the story, along for the story, those we still need to iron out. Thanks for watching.